September 12, 1944, 10:45 at night. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka moves through the darkness between the guard towers of the prisoner of war camp near Cabanatuan with a small canvas bag containing 2 cups of rice, a handful of dried fish, and the kind of moral certainty that can destroy a military career while saving human lives. The bag weighs almost nothing in his hands, but Tanaka understands that its contents represent a form of treason that could result in his execution if discovered by superior officers who have made clear that American prisoners are to receive only the minimum rations required to prevent deaths that might complicate post-war prisoner exchanges. Should Japan somehow negotiate favorable terms for ending a conflict that grows more desperate with each Allied advance. Tanaka approaches the bamboo cage where Captain James Sullivan and 7 other American officers have been confined for 3 months in conditions designed to break their spirits, while keeping them technically alive for intelligence purposes that have yielded nothing useful because hunger and dysentery have reduced them to skeletal figures whose primary concern involves surviving until the next inadequate meal arrives. Sullivan recognizes Tanaka's footsteps and moves toward the front of the cage with the careful movements of a man whose body has consumed most of its muscle mass to maintain basic organ function during months of systematic starvation that has reduced his weight from 170 pounds to perhaps 90 pounds of skin, bone, and stubborn will to live. "Lieutenant San," Sullivan whispers in the basic Japanese that he has learned during captivity, using the respectful honorific that acknowledges Tanaka's rank, while expressing gratitude for previous acts of kindness that have violated every regulation governing prisoner treatment in Japanese military facilities. Tanaka passes the canvas bag through the bamboo bars without speaking, maintaining the silence that protects both of them from detection by other guards who patrol the perimeter and who would report any unauthorized contact between Japanese personnel and American prisoners to commanding officers whose response would be swift and terminal. The rice in the bag represents Tanaka's personal ration, food that he has denied himself for 3 consecutive nights to provide additional nutrition for prisoners whose survival serves no institutional purpose, but which has become personal moral obligation that he cannot abandon despite understanding the risks to his own life and military career. Sullivan divides the food equally among his fellow prisoners with mathematical precision that reflects months of experience managing scarce resources, ensuring that each man receives exactly his share while maintaining the careful rationing that has kept all 8 Americans alive despite conditions that have killed dozens of other prisoners in adjacent sections of the camp. In war, feeding the enemy is treason. Military doctrine throughout history has recognized that providing sustenance to enemy personnel strengthens their capacity for continued resistance while potentially compromising security through unauthorized contact that might facilitate escape attempts, intelligence gathering, or the development of personal relationships that undermine institutional loyalty and operational security. But sometimes, starving prisoners reveals who we truly are. Sometimes, the systematic dehumanization that reduces enemy personnel to tactical problems requiring minimal resource allocation creates moral tests that determine whether individual conscience can survive institutional pressure to abandon basic human obligations to prevent unnecessary suffering. The Japanese prisoner of war system in the Philippines had been designed according to military doctrine that emphasized resource conservation, psychological pressure, and the extraction of intelligence information through conditions that maintained prisoner survival while providing maximum incentive for cooperation with interrogation efforts and propaganda activities. Tanaka's assignment to guard duty at Cabanatuan reflected standard rotation practices that exposed Japanese personnel to prisoner management responsibilities, while maintaining security protocols that prevented unauthorized interaction between captors and captives that might compromise institutional objectives or create personal relationships that conflicted with military efficiency. His background included childhood in rural Japan, where family traditions emphasized hospitality toward travelers, community obligation to provide food for hungry people regardless of their social status, and Buddhist teaching about compassion for all sentient beings that created moral framework for individual behavior that transcended immediate self-interest or institutional loyalty. The conflict between military duty and personal conscience had been developing throughout Tanaka's service at Cabanatuan, as he witnessed prisoner mortality rates that exceeded operational necessity and reflected systematic cruelty rather than legitimate resource conservation or security requirements. Sullivan's background included pre-war service as high school teacher in Ohio, where he had worked with students from economically disadvantaged families, developing sensitivity to hunger, malnutrition, and the psychological effects of food insecurity that created educational barriers and social problems requiring community intervention and individual assistance. His adaptation to prisoner status had included recognition that survival depended on maintaining hope, mutual support among fellow captives, and psychological resilience that could withstand systematic dehumanization while preserving personal identity and moral commitment to post-war reunion with family and community. Do you think Tanaka's decision to feed American prisoners reflected genuine humanitarian motivation, or do you think it reflected psychological rebellion against military authority that used prisoner welfare as justification for personal defiance of institutional control and professional obligations? The secret feeding operation that Tanaka initiated required careful planning that avoided detection by other guards, timing that exploited gaps in patrol schedules, and resource management that provided prisoner nutrition without creating obvious evidence of unauthorized food distribution that might trigger investigation by camp administrators. The gradual improvement in prisoner health that resulted from Tanaka's intervention created subtle changes in mortality rates, energy levels, and psychological condition that began attracting attention from superior officers who monitored camp statistics and expected continued deterioration rather than stabilization among American captives. The other Japanese guards assigned to Cabanatuan responded to Tanaka's example with reactions that ranged from admiration for his moral courage to concern about the risks that unauthorized prisoner assistance created for all personnel who might be implicated in activities that violated explicit orders about prisoner treatment and resource allocation. Some guards began providing their own forms of covert assistance to prisoners, creating informal network of humanitarian support that operated beneath official camp procedures while maintaining plausible deniability about individual participation in activities that could result in court-martial proceedings and severe punishment. The prisoners who benefited from secret feeding operations understood that their survival increasingly depended on Japanese personnel, who chose individual conscience over institutional loyalty, creating complex emotional responses that included gratitude, guilt about receiving assistance that endangered their captors, and hope that human decency might influence broader camp policies. Sullivan's role as senior American officer included responsibility for protecting fellow prisoners while managing relationships with Japanese personnel that might provide survival advantages without compromising security or encouraging unrealistic expectations about broader changes in treatment that seemed unlikely given overall military situation. The moral complexity of accepting food from enemy personnel created psychological tension for American prisoners who understood that their survival came at potential cost to Japanese soldiers whose acts of kindness violated military regulations and risked severe punishment that might include execution for treason. The conversations that developed between Tanaka and Sullivan during food distribution included limited exchanges about family backgrounds, pre-war occupations, and personal values that created human connections transcending national boundaries and military classifications while maintaining appropriate caution about security and mutual safety. Tanaka's description of his family's agricultural traditions and community values provided Sullivan with insights into Japanese culture that challenged propaganda representations while demonstrating shared human experiences of family obligation, community responsibility, and moral commitment that existed independently of military conflict. Sullivan's accounts of his teaching experience and educational philosophy created bridges between his civilian identity and current circumstances, while providing Tanaka with understanding of American values, democratic principles, and individual liberty that contradicted military indoctrination about enemy ideology and cultural inferiority. The discovery of unauthorized prisoner feeding operations occurred through systematic investigation of food supply discrepancies that camp administrators attributed to theft, waste, or unauthorized distribution that required immediate correction through enhanced security measures and disciplinary action against responsible personnel. The investigation revealed evidence of widespread prisoner assistance that implicated multiple Japanese guards and suggested organized conspiracy to violate explicit orders about prisoner treatment, creating security crisis that demanded exemplary punishment to maintain military discipline and institutional authority. Tanaka's arrest and court-martial proceedings provided opportunity for him to explain humanitarian motivations while acknowledging violation of military regulations that he understood were designed to maintain operational security and resource efficiency rather than systematic cruelty toward enemy personnel. The testimony that Tanaka provided during court-martial included references to Buddhist teaching about compassion, family traditions of hospitality, and personal conviction that unnecessary suffering violated moral principles that transcended military authority and institutional loyalty regardless of official orders or professional consequences. The American prisoner's attempts to testify on Tanaka's behalf were rejected by military court that maintained strict separation between enemy personnel and judicial proceedings, but their written statements documented his humanitarian service and requested clemency that recognized his moral courage and individual sacrifice for prisoner welfare. The sentence that military court imposed on Tanaka included demotion, imprisonment, and transfer to combat unit, where he would serve remainder of war in circumstances that reflected official disapproval of humanitarian activities while providing opportunity for redemption through conventional military service and personal sacrifice. The broader implications of Tanaka's case included enhanced security measures throughout Japanese prisoner system that prevented similar humanitarian activities while reinforcing institutional policies that prioritized operational efficiency over prisoner welfare or individual moral considerations. The other guards who had participated in unauthorized prisoner assistance faced reduced sentences that reflected their secondary role in humanitarian conspiracy, while serving as warning to remaining personnel about consequences of individual conscience that conflicted with institutional authority and military discipline. Sullivan's survival of Cabanatuan imprisonment included continued deterioration of health conditions after humanitarian feeding operations ended, but psychological impact of experiencing enemy compassion provided moral foundation for post-war reconciliation efforts and cross-cultural understanding that influenced his approach to international cooperation. The documentation of humanitarian activities at Cabanatuan appeared in post-war testimony rather than contemporary military records, as wartime security prevented official acknowledgement of individual moral choice that contradicted institutional policies while demonstrating possibilities for cross-cultural compassion during systematic dehumanization. Tanaka's combat service following court-martial included participation in desperate defensive operations that reflected Japan's deteriorating military situation, but his experience with prisoner humanitarian work had fundamentally altered his understanding of individual moral responsibility within institutional military service. The post-war reconciliation between Tanaka and Sullivan occurred through veteran organizations that facilitated contact between former enemies who sought to process wartime experiences through direct communication and mutual recognition of shared humanity that had survived military conflict and institutional hostility. Sullivan's testimony about Tanaka's humanitarian service contributed to historical documentation of individual moral choice during systematic warfare, while illustrating possibilities for compassion that transcended national boundaries and military classifications when personal conscience demanded protection of human dignity. The rice that Tanaka had shared with American prisoners became symbolic of individual capacity for moral courage that could challenge institutional cruelty through personal sacrifice and humanitarian service that served no strategic purpose except preservation of human decency during circumstances designed to eliminate compassion. The legacy of secret feeding operations at Cabanatuan included contributions to post-war understanding of individual agency within institutional military service, demonstrating that personal moral choice could influence survival outcomes while maintaining cultural identity and spiritual commitment despite official opposition and professional consequences. In the end, the food that Tanaka provided to starving American prisoners represented evidence that individual conscience could survive systematic military indoctrination to create moments of cross-cultural compassion that served fundamental human values rather than institutional loyalty or professional advancement. The punishment that Tanaka received for humanitarian service became testimony to moral courage that prioritized enemy welfare over personal safety, demonstrating that some forms of treason against military authority serve higher loyalty to universal human dignity and spiritual obligation that transcends national boundaries and temporary political conflicts. If stories like this make you think about the individual moral choices that can challenge institutional cruelty, about the food that nourishes souls while risking lives, about the acts of kindness that require extraordinary courage when institutions demand systematic dehumanization, then perhaps you understand why some officers choose conscience over career, why some feeding becomes sacred rather than treasonous, and why the most important military service sometimes involves protecting enemy humanity rather than eliminating enemy lives, choosing spiritual obligation over institutional loyalty, and demonstrating that individual compassion can survive even the most systematic training in hatred and professional violence.